There had been no doubt about the succession when Henry VIII died. Jane Seymour, the mother of Edward, was Henry's lawful wife beyond question, for Queens Katharine and Anne were both dead when he married Jane. But on the death of Edward, the matter looked very complicated in many eyes. Let us take the possible claimants in order. First, there were the two sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, who had both been declared illegitimate on the ground that their mothers had never been lawful wives. King Henry, it is true, in his later years, had received them as his daughters and as possible heirs, though the statute disqualifying them had not been repealed. Next, Henry VII had left two daughters. The elder, Margaret, married James IV of Scotland, who was killed at Flodden. His son, James V, was father of Mary, Queen of Scots, but she was excluded from right of succession by the Alien Act, having been born on a foreign soil. But further, Margaret, within a year of King James's death, had married the Earl of Angus. It is a miserable fact to have to record that the Marquis of Dorset, who now married the daughter of Brandon and Queen Mary, had put away his lawful wife in order to do so, the Lady Catherine Fitzalan, sister of the Earl of Arundel. Grey was created Duke of Suffolk on account of his royal spouse. His wife, Frances, a lady of amiable temper, brought him three daughters, the eldest being the Lady Jane Grey. And out of all this crooked dealing came a great tragedy. The Duke of Northumberland, who had risen victorious over the Seymour family and was apparently in the plenitude of power at King Edward's death, was an able, bold and unprincipled man. He had wedded his fourth son, Lord Guildford Dudley, to the Lady Jane, and caused the dying Edward to declare her his legitimate successor. Obviously this was not the case, for her mother was yet alive, and would under any circumstances have had first claim. The poor girl was only 16 years old. All accounts agree in making her both learned and amiable. She had no ambitions, but was told that duty lay upon her. The Duke for some hours kept the King's death secret, while he took measures for securing the person of Mary, and brought the Lady Jane to the Tower, and also a large number of influential peers, to swear homage to her. But the Londoners were silent. Not a single shout of welcome or Godspeed was raised as they passed through the silent crowd on their way to the Tower. The Duke was hated for his arrogance, and the interference of France and Spain was to be looked for if Mary's rights were interfered with. Northumberland, having had Jane duly proclaimed, went forth to encounter Mary, and soon saw that the game was up. The fleet off Yarmouth had declared in Mary's favour, so had the soldiers which he had sent against her. And so in the street at Cambridge he threw his cap up in the air with the cry, "God save Queen Mary!" But it availed him nothing. The Earl of Arundel, who had been forced by Northumberland to offer allegiance to Jane, but who waited his opportunity, came forward with a warrant for his arrest, signed by Mary, and on July 25th, 19 days after Edward's death, he was brought a prisoner to the Tower. On August 18th, he was tried and condemned for high treason in Westminster Hall, the Duke of Norfolk presiding as Lord High Sheriff. He was taken back to the Beauchamp Tower, and inscriptions which were cut by him and his sons may still be read on the walls. Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, had been a prisoner there under King Edward. He was now restored to his dignity, and he paid a visit to Northumberland, who, in the hope of saving his life, declared himself a Catholic. Gardiner naturally took the opportunity. Mass was celebrated in the White Tower Chapel, and the Duke received after making recantation. Next day he was beheaded on Tower Hill, still clinging desperately to the hope of life, and making profession all the way to the scaffold of the fervency of his faith. Meanwhile, the 9 days' reign of the hapless Lady Jane was at an end. She was consigned to the lieutenant's lodging, called the King's House, and her husband to the Beauchamp Tower, where the one word Jane, carved on the wall by him, is still to be seen. All through the month of September, Jane was allowed to walk in the garden, and her husband and his brother Henry to promenade the outer walk on the wall which leads from the Beauchamp to the bell tower. Queen Mary was crowned with great splendour on October 1st. She was accompanied by her half-sister Elizabeth. On November 13th, a procession went forth from the Tower Gate to the Guildhall. First the gentleman chief warder, carrying the axe, next Archbishop Cranmer, followed by Lord Guildford Dudley and Lady Jane, the last named accompanied by 2 of her ladies. They were arraigned for high treason, the Lord Mayor presiding with the Duke of Norfolk as High Sheriff. They pleaded guilty, received sentence, and were taken back to the Tower. It is possible that Mary may have had it in her mind to spare Lady Jane's life, but there came a new event, namely, Wyatt's ill-starred rising against the projected marriage of Queen Mary with Philip of Spain. The opinion of the nation was strongly against it, and Wyatt was certainly moved with an honest purpose. Wyatt started from Maidstone after publishing a declaration against the Queen's marriage and advanced with a numerous force to Rochester, where he defeated the Duke of Norfolk and Sir Henry Jerningham, who had been sent against him. Then he moved on to Gravesend, where he was met by some members of the Privy Council, who exhorted him to make known his grievances in a less disorderly manner. He assented, provided the custody of the Tower and the Queen within it were entrusted to him. This condition being declined, he went on towards London. Mary was exhorted to take refuge in the Tower, but cowardice was not one of her faults. She refused and offered a reward of £100 a year to any man who would bring her Wyatt's head. She also gave out to the citizens of London that she would not marry Philip if the match should be disagreeable to the nation. Wyatt, too, unappalled by his perilous situation, appeared at Southwark, opposite the Tower, fired upon it, and was fired upon by the garrison on both sides without effect. But the fact is to be noted as the last time in its history that the Tower was ever attacked. Wyatt was confined in the first floor of the Great Keep, his adherents in the crypt beneath. It is hardly to be wondered at that this fixed the fate of poor Lady Jane. Her father was imprisoned on February 10th. 2 days before Feckenham, the Queen's confessor, afterwards Abbot of Westminster, was sent to bid her and her husband prepare for death and to exhort them to embrace the Roman faith. But on this point they were both firm in their refusal, and the 12th was fixed for the fatal day. It was originally intended that they should both die on Tower Hill, but the fear that Jane's beauty, simplicity and sweetness would excite popular sympathy induced the authorities to change the place of her suffering to the Tower Green. When Lord Guildford was told this, he requested a final interview with her, but she declined it, lest it should change their constancy. On the day appointed he was led forth, and as he passed the window of Master Partridge's house, where she was confined, she waved her farewell to him. At the Bulwark Gate, the sheriffs met him and conducted him to the scaffold, where he met his fate with firmness. The body was conveyed on a litter to the Tower Chapel, and Jane saw it on its way thither. When the lieutenant of the Tower came to conduct her to her death and asked her for some small present which he might keep in memory of her, she gave him her tablets on which she had just written 3 sentences, Latin, Greek, and English. At the scaffold, she addressed the bystanders, protesting that she had erred through bad advice, in the belief that she was serving the interests of the country and that she submitted to the consequences of her error without murmuring. "11 days later, her father, the Duke of Suffolk, was beheaded, and many other participators in the ill-concerted rebellion were also put to death. 3 were hanged at Maidstone, 3 at Sevenoaks. More than 50 died in the city on the block or the gallows. The gates and London Bridge were disfigured with clusters of rotting heads. In several of the principal streets, gibbets bore their ghastly burdens in chains, and the air was tainted far and wide. In the midst of this time, Mary was married to Philip at Winchester. Wyatt, who was put to death on April 11th, had used some expressions which were held to implicate, among others, the Princess Elizabeth. The latter was lying sick, in semi-custody, at Ashridge in Herts, and a strong guard was sent to escort her to London, which performed its duty so zealously as to force admission into her bedchamber. She was brought, in spite of her remonstrances, by easy stages to London, and remained for a fortnight in close confinement at Whitehall, and was then conveyed to the Tower. Her angry protestations made a scene as she was landed at Traitor's Gate on Palm Sunday, that day being fixed upon because the citizens were strictly ordered to church, and it was feared that popular disaffection would be exhibited if the princess was conducted through the city. Whilst in the Tower, her confinement was of the most rigid character. She was frequently examined by the council, but nothing against her could be found, and Wyatt with his dying breath declared her innocence. On May 19th she was liberated from the Tower and conveyed under the charge of Sir Henry Bedingfield to Woodstock. Queen Mary died on November 17th, 1558, and the accession of Elizabeth was certainly hailed with joy by the English nation. Elizabeth was at Hatfield when her sister died. On November 28th she came to London and entered, amidst general acclamations, the fortress where she had been so rigorously imprisoned. It is no wonder if it found no charms for her. On December 5th she retired first to Somerset House, then to Whitehall, where she remained until the eve of her coronation, when she came back to the Tower again. The procession from hence to the Abbey was more splendid than any that had been recorded. Seated in an open chariot all glittering with gold, herself blazing with jewels, she was carried through streets strewn with flowers, with banners and tapestry on the houses. the conduits running wine and the city companies manning the streets in their gorgeous liveries. Though the horrors of the stake were at an end, religious persecution was not, and the Tower seldom appears in the reign of Elizabeth, save as a state prison. The reformers were only too ready to retaliate on the Romish party, and so the Bishop of Winchester, who had rendered himself obnoxious under Mary, was soon in durance here, and was followed by the Archbishop of York, the Bishops of Ely, Lincoln, Worcester, Exeter and Bath, and by Feckenham, Abbot of Westminster and other church dignitaries, for denying the Queen's supremacy. An illustrious name comes before us in the annals of 1592. Sir Walter Raleigh was lodged here, having incurred the Queen's displeasure by his amour with Elizabeth, daughter of Sir Nicholas Throckmorton, the celebrated statesman. He soon regained his liberty, however, by using the most fulsome adulation of his royal mistress. Elizabeth was always open to flattery, but in this case her love-stricken swain was further assisted by the arrival at Dartmouth of his good ship the Roebuck, which had taken a great Spanish treasure ship off Flores, with a treasure which Raleigh estimated at £500,000. The Queen gave him his liberty and sent him off to arrange the disposal of his capture, and of course got the lion's share of it. He returned to court fresh as ever, and this return was a fatal event in the fortunes of another brilliant courtier, in fact the most brilliant of Elizabeth's surrounding, Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. He and Raleigh were bitter enemies. Ireland was again giving trouble. Raleigh advised that the disturbers should remorselessly be trampled out, Essex that justice and goodwill should be shown. The discussion between them was firm on both sides, and when we remember that both men were high-spirited, full of ambition, jealous of each other as to the royal favour, we can understand how their self-will and egotism proved the ruin of them both. Essex was strikingly handsome, brilliant both at court and in the field. His father had been a personal friend of the Queen, Shakespeare his friend. He was now sent to Ireland with the task before him of subduing the factions which kept the country in continual insurrection, and he failed, whilst his enemies traduced him at home. Enraged at learning this, and in despair at his continued ill fortune, he returned after 2 years to England unbidden, hoping to justify his actions in the presence of the Queen. But several charges of misconduct were proved against him, and he was deprived of his offices and banished from court. The Queen had said that an unruly horse must be kept short of provender, and when this was repeated to him, he retorted that the Queen's mind was as crooked as her body, and it is difficult to imagine a speech which would anger her more. Then he formed the desperate resolution of breaking in upon the court, removing by force the courtiers, and so ruling the Queen by force. A terrible blunder to make. He was perhaps the most popular noble in London, but the citizens had no idea of imperiling their lives and fortunes by countenancing such a harum-scarum idea as this. Nobody came to his call, and after a short siege in his own house in the Strand, he was captured, along with the Earl of Southampton, and conveyed through the fatal Traitor's Gate. This was on February 6, 1601. On the 19th he was adjudged a traitor, and on the 25th beheaded. The execution took place within the Tower, some say because Essex was so popular that there was a fear of a demonstration in his favour if it had been on Tower Hill, others that it was his own wish to die within the walls. He was buried in St. Peter's Chapel. Elizabeth, as one can quite understand, was unwilling to sign the warrant, considering the favour in which she had once held him, and after its execution she fell into a terrible fit of despondency, from which in fact she never recovered. Sad enough are the accounts of the last days of the great Queen, her loneliness and terror. She seemed to have no one near her to whom she could look for a loving or tender word. But she was a great monarch, and under her rule England rose out of weakness, confusion, distraction. Elizabeth had triumphed over all her enemies. Her bitterest foe, Philip of Spain, had gone to his grave 5 years before her, but not until he had seen his invincible armada beaten all to pieces. England was now in the first rank of the nations.